First panel have already told and profiled some of the themes I wanted to deal with. In particular, Professor Krakower has already pointed out the importance, some of the pillars of the importance and the central role of networking on both a strategic and a cultural level. Well, I've been working on religious heritage since 10 years and on religious tourism since more or less 2012. And the more I work in this field, the less I understand about it. Because it is really a difficult theme, it is a difficult framework, it is really difficult to find the right balance between the cooperation among all the different institutions and the different visions which are involved, which are profoundly engaged in the common purpose of promoting and enhancing cultural landscapes within a religious history scenario. Today I will try to share with you some of the questions I have pointed out in the last few years spent around Europe trying to better understand which are the roles, which are the characteristics of multi-religious heritage and multi-religious tourism. In particular, I've had the pleasure to work and to cooperate with many international institutions, with many international associations aimed at promoting religious tourism as a driver for the rapprochement of culture. As you've probably seen from the abstract in the program of the conference, I have found my presentation on three main questions, and I will try to share with you some doubts, some criticalities that I've found during my professional experience, and that I would like to discuss with you with the aim of trying to identify some possible answers or solutions. The first problem is the difficult balance between the preservation of, I would say, the specific nature of religious heritage and the necessity to make it accessible to visitors and to tourists. The second one is about the necessity to preserve and to conserve and to promote the complexity of cultural and religious heritage, and at the same time to make it accessible from a semiotic point of view. And the third one is about the critical, the potential, I would say, richness and the potential importance of the use of an aware use of new technologies, and at the same time of the dangers and the threats that are connected with a lack of awareness in the use of ICTs. First of all, the theme of authenticity leads us to question the relationship between understanding and representation of places in a complex environment which is heavily influenced by the social construction of the virtual identity of places, by the central role of marketing in promotion of touristic destination, and also from the everlasting process of changing in cultural backgrounds and in cultural dimension of new society. In recent years, also storytelling has become a fashionable concept without a real reflection on what story should be told. But what does it mean to tell a story? What consequences has a narrative action? Does history necessarily have to be philologically and historically correct? Or we just have, or we just can decide to tell a story to promote the nature and the profile of cultural heritage and religious history? Obviously, everything depends on the purpose of interaction between the visitor and the cultural site we want to promote. But we must be aware that each management plan of a cultural site must be based on a clear decision on the different targets we want to talk with. In the years of the rapid growth of global tourism in the 90s of 20th century, the International Council of Monuments and Sites has been questioning the relationship between cultural management plans and authenticity, trying to suggest in the NARA document on authenticity of 1994 to reflect about the role of real values of cultural sites. The document declares that in a world that is increasingly subject to the forces of globalization, the essential contribution made by the consideration of authenticity in conservation practice is to clarify and illuminate the collective memory of humanity. And again, it declares that the diversity of cultures and heritage in our world is an irreplaceable source of spiritual and intellectual richness for all humankind. The purpose of the statement is for the first time to focus attention on the heterogeneous nature of the sources that can be used to define the authentic nature of a site or religious heritage within its wider social and cultural framework. Some years later, in 2008, the General Assembly of ICOMOS, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, held in Quebec, deepened the reflection distinguishing the two phases of interpretation and presentation of cultural heritage. The so-called ICOMOS Charter for the Interpretation and Presentation of Cultural Heritage has defined many principles to help preserve the historical and cultural value of a place, starting from a proper process of interpretation of sources and from an adequate contextualization for external interpreters and visitors. If we want to properly present a place, we must interpret it correctly. Now, I don't want to deepen the great theme of the semiotics of cultural heritage, and we don't have the time to open today the great chapter of semiotics of sacred place. But we must be aware that making a place culturally accessible means deciding what values we want to convey. We will have to select information, we have to carefully identify the purpose of the presentation, we have to profile the potential target of visitors and users. However, in all these variables, we will have to respect the authenticity and the sacred nature of sites, or the sacred nature of religious history of a site, of a religious heritage. We will have, moreover, to pay attention to some of the risks that always accompany the educational contexts, including the tourist destinations. We must not banalize or mystify or overexploit the history of places. First of all, talking about destination means talking about preserving the original values of a place. The second major question, closely related to the former one, concerns the accessibility of cultural sites. In this case, I'm not talking about physical accessibility, but rather about conceptual accessibility. Once again, the problem remains to be able to identify the central elements for describing a cultural site and to translate it into a universally understandable language. The construction of a conceptual infrastructure of a tourism product requires a reflection on the language of the audience. From my point of view, from my experience, culture has to be inclusive and must therefore be accessible regardless of every possible target. I don't want to say that everything must be necessarily simplified, but that everyone must have access to the richness of cultural heritage of humanity. In the specific case we are talking about in these days, I think it's important to tackle the problem starting from an example. Let's imagine to be in a museum in front of a 15th century manuscript of a Megillat Esther. If in the caption we find simply the description Megillat Esther, 15th century Italy, only people who grew up in a Jewish cultural context can understand exactly what that means. Perhaps we could also add some description to try to make it easier to understand. For example, the Megillat Esther is the scroll that is read for on the occasion of the Purim's festival. But again, we simply move the problem to another place. What does Purim mean for a person grown up and educated in another cultural system? With this simple example, I just wanted to show how important it is to try to address the topic of site communication from the perspective of universal conceptual accessibility, for two main reasons. The first one, to ensure that the cultural site can really represent an element of richness, understandable and accessible for the whole humanity. The second one, from the point of view of the tourism industry, because a self-referential representation or presentation of a site is likely to reduce the number of potential visitors. Once again, we must find a balance between the need to restore and to preserve the historical complexity of a place and the responsibility to keep it conceptually accessible to everyone. Along with the design for all model, which is globally conditioning the infrastructure design for physical accessibility of social spaces, we should consider a sort of conceptual design for all, which guarantees the adoption of a semiotic neutral system respecting the characteristics and needs of each potential visitor. We talked about authenticity and accessibility. The two themes are interrelated in some areas of application, Both concern representation, communication, interaction, social participation in the cultural definition of a place. Both concern the need to ensure the function of the landscape as a social space. Sites must be understood, described, made visible, made accessible. But from the point of view of the tourism industry, they must be attractive, interactive, and stimulating. In all of these different aspects, obviously, it is necessary to establish tools that at the same time could allow efficient communication of places and simplify the description of tourism offers and make them accessible to all the potential targets. To do this, we need digital interfaces, media tools, and social media and networks tools. In order to be able to use them effectively and correctly, however, we must clearly have in mind our expectations and our specific needs. For what purpose do we need new technologies? How can they support us in how we manage sites or create tourism products? I'm not a computer engineer, so I will base my reflection on my experience as a cultural manager and as a policy manager for cultural destinations. The richness that derives from the correct use of new technologies is based on software functionalities, on social potentialities, on the ability to operate on multiple narratives simultaneously, and in the last few years on gamification features. Today, I will only bring back 3 examples of the potential use of new technologies underlining a methodological premise. New technologies are and remain an instrument that requires a clear understanding of the use and the purpose. It is very easy to be distracted by the potential of the digital tools, but we will only make it constructive if we have the ability to drive it in the right direction. I would say that even if we buy the most innovative iron on the market, it doesn't mean that automatically we will learn to iron. And so we need to better understand which is the role, which could be the central role of new technologies within a strategy, within a clear strategy of development and implementation of our site management plan. The first potential feature of new technologies is the creation of the tourism product, its online visibility, and the possibility to stimulate and to allow the access, the total or the partial visit to the sites, even to people who cannot travel. The use of this kind of instrument can have functional consequences and technological additional tools. Accessibility is guaranteed, and somehow sites are made globally accessible. It is possible to link the presentation of the tourist product to the logistics virtual infrastructure, hotel booking portals, electronic ticketing, travel consultants. It is possible to create multimedia frames that make site presentations more appealing and make products more emotionally engaging. Instagram, Vimeo, YouTube are just some examples of social networks that could allow to create a real social direction in the presentation of sites and tourist paths. The second feature derives from the ability to use social media and social networks as a constructive tool. Social networks, as well as all the interactivity tools of our websites, give us the opportunity to know in real time the reaction of visitors, travelers towards our proposals. Every social interaction, every comment gives us the opportunity to analyze the perception of the target and to conduct what is now defined as sentiment analysis. Again, we have a great flow of information which remains completely useless if we do not properly analyze and translate it into an everlasting process of reformulation of communication strategies. If we want the value of interactivity to be really profitable, every feedback must lead us to a new reflection about what we are doing and the way we are doing it. Finally, new technologies enable us to operate tourism products and travel experiences through flow management strategies. Global tourism is based on the geographies of mobility that are determined by the so-called big attractors. Venice, Florence, Rome, Paris, Amsterdam, Barcelona are the centers which can activate the traveler's interest and determine the impetus for the journey. The new technologies give us the opportunity to explain to the tourist that Venice is just a starting point. It's just the surface of a beauty of the Italian landscape, and that just a few kilometers away, they can visit another unforgettable place and discover invisible and unknown sights. Managing flows means orienting the tourist's motivation towards attractors and turning it into curiosity for other places. The same method must be used in the construction of tourist products for a Jewish target. The geographical dispersion of Jewish communities over the centuries has resulted in a widespread distribution throughout the world. If we limit our perspective to the European case, in every country of Europe we can find hundreds of forgotten and abandoned Jewish cultural sites. Not all sites can become the destination of a touristic path, but many of them would deserve it. We must therefore start from the potential of using new technologies to build a product capable of attracting the great flows that arrive, for example, to Venice, and to bring them to see the Jewish cemetery of Vittorio Veneto, just 1 hour far from here. However, it is necessary to further open the perspective and to try to remember that also the history of Jewish heritage must be contextualized in a history of human and cultural landscape, gastronomy, dialects, arts, and philosophy of the many scenery in Europe have been strongly influenced by the Jewish tradition. Whenever we can enhance Jewish heritage, we will have to remember that we should enhance also the complex cultural heritage that characterizes the richness of the human landscape. Let me say just a few words on an experimental tour operator who is working here in Venice on cultural tourism. The Wanderjack project has been created last year by a young Venetian entrepreneur, which comes from the bad experience of cruise ship tourism, and who decided to turn her experience into a new model for responsible tourism, for ethical business within the wider frame of cultural tourism. The project was born to promote tourism as an experience of life, as an experience based on human interaction and somehow on existential interrogation, and not just as a walk in a place to collect selfies. I have analyzed in the last few months many cultural projects on tourism industry, and I tried to identify positive examples of responsible tourism from both a social and a cultural point of view. Wanderjack represents a unique case of interpenetration between business strategy and cultural vision, with the clear analysis of the potential target, and with the ability to differentiate cultural offerings according to the different needs of the potential target. I'm talking about this example because I've had the pleasure in the last few months to follow the constant work of the team which have been working in the creation of products dedicated to religious targets, with a particular attention to the forgotten places of Jewish memory, for now in Veneto and in Sicily. It is possible to work well. It is possible to create positive tourism models for the local community, for cultural heritage, and for a wider conception of social development. It is possible to turn the tourism industry into a driver for social development and cultural diplomacy. It is possible to preserve historical memory and to disseminate historical knowledge through the travel experience. It is necessary, however, that all those who work in the Jewish tourism sector know that cultural tourism today requires a complex vision and a full understanding of the potential and consequences of tourism on a global scale. When we talk about tourism today, we talk about a social impact. Jewish tourism could become a pillar in the European strategy for the enhancement of cultural diplomacy, with the difficult aim of approaching cultures in these complicated years. This conference represents a great opportunity for sharing visions, for joining efforts, for creating networks and new partnerships. But the most important thing that we have to keep in our mind is that tourism can really change the future of a territory. When we talk about tourism, no matter the place, no matter the destination, we have to talk also about responsibility. Thank you.